Ad cena mani providi, soli salutis candidi.
In this video, we will explore some of the ideas that Rousseau puts forth in one of his most important works, The Social Contract. We shall see it in the context of his time and also ours to see how his ideas may translate to the real world into systems of governance and society. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was born in France in the early 18th century and would eventually become one of the most important influences towards the Age of Enlightenment through his works in political philosophy, of which The Social Contract could be considered his magnum opus. Originally released alongside Emile, it is a culmination of his lifetime's work, in which the full maturation of his thoughts can be perceived, and although it should be read alongside some of his other works, such as Emile and Letters on the Mount, to gain full understanding, it stands alone quite perfectly. The fundamental purpose of this work was to find if there can be any legitimate government at all, as he explains, based on rights and not in power or coercion, as he perceived was the case throughout most of human history. He goes on to assert that the power to coerce is not a legitimate power in itself, as no one would willingly agree to give their freedom and depart from their natural state only to end in a position worse than their prior one, thus rendering the idea of slavery absurd and not based on legitimate rights. The strongest is never strong enough to be always the master, unless he transforms strength into right, and obedience into duty. Hence, the right of the strongest, which, though to all seeming meant ironically, is really laid down as a fundamental principle. But are we never to have an explanation of this phrase? Force is a physical power, and I fail to see what moral effect it can have. To yield to force is an act of necessity, not of will, at the most, an act of prudence. He argues that people are originally born free, and though misleading, what he means is that people are born to be free, and this will be what he describes as the natural state, where people still retain all their freedom and they may help themselves of any goods they can acquire, as the only limitations in this state will be the physical limitations of the individual himself. I suppose men to have reached a point at which the obstacles in the way of their preservation in their state of nature show their power of resistance to be greater than the resources at their disposal of each individual for his maintenance in that state. That primitive condition can then subsist no longer, and the human race would perish unless it changed its manner of existence. But, as men cannot engender new forces, but only unite and direct existing ones, they have no other means of preserving themselves than the formation, by aggregation, of a sum of forces great enough to overcome the resistance. And thus, the social contract is born from the collection of people who forsake natural freedom and form the compact. This is what in turn gives them civic freedom, in exchange for the natural freedom that they had to sacrifice. In this sense, they may not be thoroughly free as they were in their natural state, to have anything they like or do anything they might, but are now equally subjected to all the duties and benefits of the society they have begotten. Herein lies their retaining liberty, even when technically fettered by the laws of a system. Instead of destroying natural inequality, the fundamental compact substitutes for such physical inequality as nature may have set up between men, an equality that is moral and legitimate, and that men, who may be unequal in strength or intelligence, become everyone equal by convention and legal right. This act of association in turn creates a sovereign, which should be understood as the active body of people acting upon themselves or the world. And it is said not that the individuals have power, but rather it is the sovereign who wields this power inherited from the compact of people. Its function is to represent the collection of people in making laws, or when deciding on foreign affairs. In synthesis, the sovereign is when the people act collectively in one direction. It must be noted that although the rulers can will the sovereign, they should only do so by following the will of the people, as Rousseau argues that when the rulers or governments do so without the consent of citizens, they do so illegitimately, and thus fall outside of the social contract and should in this stage be deposed by the people. I hold then that sovereignty, being nothing less than the exercise of the general will, can never be alienated, and that the sovereign, who is no less than a collective being, cannot be represented except by himself. The power indeed may be transmitted, but not the will. Sovereignty, for the same reason as makes it inalienable, is indivisible, for will either is or is not general. It is the will either of the body of the people or only part of it. In the first case, the will, when declared, is an act of sovereignty and constitutes law. In the second, it is merely a particular will or act of magistracy, at the most a decree. Then comes the question of how this sovereign is wielded legitimately, namely, which laws will the people want to submit themselves to, and within their newly acquired civic freedom, what human endeavors will be deemed worthy or acceptable, as forming a compact is only the first step, and the second and last is the final question of governance. And naturally, this governance will have to be one that by necessity has to work for the benefit of every individual in as much as for the collective good of the compact itself. To answer this question, Rousseau formulates the theory of the general will, which as he describes is born from the collection of all the individual wills within the compact. This general will is simply the addition of every individual wills, which then, in turn, sways the sovereign in one direction or another. It is only called general will when it serves the general good, and otherwise it is simply particular wills acting of their own volition. Rousseau was well aware that in certain situations, individual wills could conflict, or tend towards the benefit of particulars and not the general as a whole, but as he says, this would have no effect on whether the general will is beneficial for all, for in that case the votes of individualists would nullify with the rest of the votes. And in this sense, the general will shall always emerge victorious and be for the benefit of all members of the society, even those who oppose it in particular situations. He also adds to this that when people do vote against the general will, they do so either by ignorance or deception. As he argues, no one will tend to favor that which is detrimental to his own well-being. It follows from what has gone before that the general will is always right and tends to the public advantage. But it does not follow that the deliberations of people are always equally correct. Our will is always for our own good, but we do not always see what that is. The people is never corrupted, but it is often deceived, and on such occasions only does it seem to will what is bad. After setting the foundations for legitimate government and society, Rousseau then moves on to speak about different styles of governance. He mainly concerns himself with democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy, regarding them to be the best among the rest. He argues that the size of the state is what will determine what style of government will be most useful, democracy being for small states, aristocracy for medium states, and monarchy for large states. The reason for this distinction lies in the amount of power and bureaucracy required to maintain order, which scales with the size of the collective of citizens. In contrast to modern times, where we have far deviated from these principles of governance, most countries follow the style of a representative republic. This system is a mixture of most of the aforementioned forms of government, where a body of representatives is elected by the people to wield the power of the sovereign, and though it seems that it translates perfectly from democracy, aristocracy, or monarchy, Rousseau believed representative republics to be facades of freedom, because the general will would only exist in times of election, and the rest of the time, the elected representatives can wield the sovereign power freely without concerns for the general will. Sovereignty, for the same reason that makes it inalienable, cannot be represented. It lies essentially in the general will, and will does not admit of representation. It is either the same or other. There is no intermediate possibility. The deputies of the people, therefore, are not and cannot be its representatives. They are merely its stewards and can carry through no definitive acts. Every law the people has not ratified in person is null and void, is, in fact, not a law. The people of England regards itself as free, but it is grossly mistaken. It is free only during the election of members of parliament. As soon as they are elected, slavery overtakes it and it is nothing. The use it makes of the short moments of liberty it enjoys shows indeed that it deserves to lose them. The idea of representation is modern. It comes to us from feudal governments, from that iniquitous and absurd system which degrades humanity and dishonors the name of man. Today, this condition is made worse by the military might that each country has, which is generally beholden to the representatives themselves, namely the governments, instead of the general will of the people. And as such, in the rare cases where the people will rightly desire to depose the representatives for not upholding their side of the contract, they will soon be confronted by the army, who will generally defend the interests of the representatives. In such cases, where two wills exist within the same compact, namely, the general will and the private will of representatives, it is plain to see how governments can easily break their end of the social contract by having begotten a will of their own, which does not follow the general will. And even when, under the rule of law, representative republic, this is not inherently a political crime, it is still an act of coercion when any will other than the general will is enforced upon the citizens. In a perfect act of legislation, the individual or particular will should be at zero. The corporate will belonging to the government should occupy a very subordinate position, and, consequently, the general or sovereign will should always predominate and should be the sole guide of all the rest. According to the natural order, on the other hand, these different wills become more active in proportion as they are concentrated. Thus, the general will is always the weakest, the corporate will second, and the individual will strongest of all. So that in the government, each member is first of all himself, then a magistrate, and then a citizen, in an order exactly the reverse of what the social system requires. Another aspect of Rousseau's thought, though implied throughout the text, he later voices explicitly when arguing that one of the main symptoms of a dying society is when political apathy becomes the norm. As part of what assures the equality and civic freedom of each citizen lies in the equal bearing of duty, of which political exercise is one of them. Today we can see this disenfranchisement everywhere, where many people, due to disappointment and tiredness, decide to turn away from the political process. In a well-ordered city, every man flies to the assemblies. Under a bad government, no one cares to stir a step to get to them, because no one is interested in what happens there, because it is foreseen that the general will not prevail, and lastly, because domestic cares are all absorbing. Good laws leads to the making of better ones, bad ones bring about the worse. As soon as a man says of the affairs of the state, "What does it matter to me?" the state may be given up for lost. To conclude this video, it is worth mentioning some of the criticisms that were laid against his theories both in his time and after, most of which was related to the intellectual coherency of some of his theories, such as that of the general will, where it is argued that as soon as the majority of citizens desire or vote for something that goes against the general good, then the general will becomes noxious for the society. It is not hard to see how a certain populace can certainly harm themselves by means of individualism or desires based on vice. Originality was another concern, as people argued that the idea of the social contract was not new, and it certainly was not. The theory of the social contract dates back to the Greeks and was employed by many thinkers before him, though the importance lies on how Rousseau thought about it. A remarkable contrast can be seen when comparing Hobbes, who is considered to have inspired Rousseau, and what he thought about the social contract, where he asserts that people become ipso facto enslaved when the compact is formed, as they forsake their personal liberties in creating it, and become subject to the sovereign. Here Rousseau argues that it is precisely because of the formation of the compact that they become free, in a civic sense that is. And as it is through the coming together of many people that the sovereign is formed, the sovereign is thus subjected to the people themselves and not to those who at any time wield the power of the sovereign body. Yet, one of the most important criticisms to keep in mind when reading his works is his belief that humans are inherently good. By this he means that humans are fundamentally innocent, without the contact of society, but then by establishing a relationship with society is that they become corrupted. In this sense, he views human evil as brought forth from the evils of society itself and not from within humans, and the noble savage, or uncivilized human in this sense, being also the ideal, is expiated from any sin or evil. Regardless of the flaws in his thinking and his theories, the social contract and the rest of his works are timeless documents which will go to become part of the main building blocks in Western political philosophy, and will later influence the French Revolution and thinkers such as Kant and Hegel. And though today we have far departed from his beliefs, we owe much to that which he established about rights, duty, and legitimate political rule.